Hi, this is Lou Pulsfer, and I'm going to discuss the board as a topic in game design. I'm describing boards. I'm not going to try to define them, because as soon as somebody says definition, somebody else, and usually a lot of somebody else's, will nitpick it. And given the loosey-goosey nature of English, the ambiguity of English, it's impossible or nearly impossible to get any definition that can't be nitpicked. So, foo on definitions. I'm just going to talk about game boards. Why do we use boards in games? Well, board is a natural way to show maneuver and geospatial relationships between locations. And that's virtually required for a war game, because a war game depicts warfare, and warfare is all about maneuver and spatial relationships. Cards, on the other hand, don't do that naturally. You can make them do it, but they don't do it naturally. Of course, you can use a board as a status indicator, and that's true in many Euro games, which are essentially abstract games. Card games are essentially abstract games. But if you want to depict something like a warfare, then you've got to have a model of a reality rather than a pure abstraction. So we're interested in boards as fields for maneuver that depict geospatial relationships, which is as close as you're going to get me to defining a board. Is there a formula for designing a board? Strangely enough, I've seen lots of novice designers or wannabe designers ask if there's a formula, as though everything you do in game design could be reduced to formulas to always correct solutions, reduced to rote. And in fact, game design is the opposite of that. So the answer is no, there is no formula for designing a board. Game design is about critical thinking when you get down to it, and that's the opposite of rote learning. However, we can see common characteristics in many classic game boards and common ways to make boards, and that's what I'm going to talk about. The first and most obvious way to make a game board is to have a square grid. Chess, checkers, tic-tac-toe, Stratego, even the video game Civilization, and I suspect many other video games underneath, use a square grid. It's easy to see. It's easy to make prototypes, it's easy to program if you're doing a video game, it's easy for the players to understand. However, there are some problems with squares. The most prominent is that movement diagonally is very distorted. It's 1.41 times as far per square. And that's why occasionally you'll see a game where moving diagonally will cost you 1.5 movement points or movement capability rather than just one. Adjacency is also a problem. Is it just the 4 squares that are adjacent, the orthogonal squares? Or is it all 8, the orthogonal and the diagonal? Now, if you're depicting walls like in a dungeon, or roads as in a city, squares are very useful because they're straight, as opposed to the other common grid, which is hexagons, which is not straight. Of course, then you have areas, which are like a map. So perhaps the most natural looking game board is the area map. And Diplomacy, Risk, Axis and Allies, My Own Britannia, and a great many other games that cover large geographical areas are going to use area maps. Many times area maps are used when you can have more than one piece in a location, as opposed to squares or hexagons, where you usually have one piece or a few pieces per location. If you think of Axis and Allies, you can have dozens of pieces in one place. The other thing that an area board does is it provides for individuality, for flexibility. It avoids the geometric precision of squares and hexes. So if there's a place where there ought to be small areas because it takes a long time to move through them, you can do it. Or if you want to get your shading and so on in your map to fit real terrain, as in the Britannia map here, you can do it. Now, the other common grid form is hexagons or hexes, and hex means 6. So there are 6 hexes adjacent to every other hex, and that's quite clear as opposed to squares where you have the ambiguity of 4 and 8. This is also the typical war game grid because Charles S. Roberts adopted it for the early Avalon Hill games because it does a better job of matching reality and it's not as distorted as squares, although Tactics 2 used squares. It is not uniform, however. If you look at a hex board one way, you have 2 ways to move forward. If you look at it 90 degrees rotated, there are 3 ways to move forward. And if you start measuring distances, there is a difference. Also, a hex board is not so good for straight lines as compared to a square board. If you want to do a dungeon or a city or something like that, then a square board may be better. You can also ask, do hexes put people off? Because when people see a hex board, do they think, oh, that's a war game? And a lot of people don't want to play war games these days. On the other hand, a really popular game like Ingenious by Rainer Knizia uses hexes, and that doesn't seem to cause a problem. So I'm not sure that hexes do put people off, but it's conceivable. Here we have another type of board, the connectivity board. You have dots or circles or squares and lines that show connections. Now the illustration I have here is a space war game, and so these connections could be wormhole connections, the only routes you can follow, but it can be used for land areas just as well. And connectivity diagrams allow for easy representation of choke points and routes, paths, bridges, impassable terrain because you just don't have any connections across them, and so forth. So there's a lot of flexibility there. But it looks kind of odd. Now, when you think about it, all of these grids are simply ways of showing connectivity between locations. So here I have a connectivity map, a connectivity diagram, I guess you would say, of the Fantasy Flight version of the Britannia map. So this is exactly equivalent in connectivity with the Britannia map from a few slides earlier. It doesn't look as good, but it's quite clear. There are a couple of problems where lines cross other lines, and that's something that can happen with a connectivity diagram like this that does not happen with an area map. And perhaps that's one reason why what you might call a naked connectivity diagram like this is very rarely used. And there are other sorts of grids, circular grids, which are quite good for depicting solar systems, as this one does on the left. Spirals, that's pretty unusual. A prototype that I've worked on the right, and there are lots of other variations. Now consider also, not all boards are boards that depict maneuver. They may only depict placement. In other words, there's no moving around once you're there, but there are still geospatial relationships between the locations. And Knizia's Ingenious is one. I have a prototype at Mayfair that they'll publish someday that uses hexes and placement and does not use maneuver. Now those two are hex boards, but you can use it for square boards too. In fact, tic-tac-toe is an example, and Go is the most famous placement-only game using the intersections of a square grid rather than the squares themselves. So you can have boards that depict spatial relationships but that don't provide for maneuver simply because the game doesn't use maneuver for whatever reason. Now, what do these boards have in common? The number of areas in many classic games don't vary wildly from chess, which is 64. Diplomacy has 70-some, as I recall. Risk has 42. Britannia has 37. Now, Axis and Allies has a lot more, although there's lots of different boards for Axis and Allies. Some are larger than others. This also depends on the number of pieces. And one of the reasons why we have hex boards is hex boards can provide room for one heck of a lot of pieces. If you stack them 3 high and you have 500 hexes, you can have an awful lot of pieces on the board. Whereas games which have more classic style boards like Diplomacy or Risk or Britannia, most of them have relatively low piece counts. Diplomacy only allows 1 piece per area, and you can only have 34 on the board because it's a zero-sum game. In Risk you can have a lot of pieces because you can pile a lot into one place, although Risk would probably be a better game if there were a limit to how many you could put in one place. And Britannia on average has about 55 pieces on the board, sometimes more, sometimes less. Is there a commonality in the number of connections? Well, a hex board always has 6 connections from one place to another. Square board's 4 to 8. You can take a board and count the number of connections, which I actually did with that Space War game connectivity board. I wanted to see, in effect, how much room there was for maneuvering through, which the number of connections affects. However, at this point, maybe we're overthinking these things, and you can overthink anything in games. So I'd say, at some point, try actually playing on a board, and you'll find out a lot about your game if you pay attention. Don't overthink it. So, think of a board as a connectivity diagram for maneuver replacement, and go from there to choose a grid that works best for you.